It's always amazing to see what ideas people come up with to turn a civilian technological achievement into new weapons. Take, for example, the steam engine, which used to be given to technology-enthusiastic boys as a miniature version for Christmas. Paul Henkels, as Professor Bummel, already explained the operating principle to us quite accurately in the legendary 1944 film comedy The Punch Bowl. So, what is a steam engine? Let's just pretend we don't know anything, and then we say, a steam engine. That's a big black room. It has a hole at the back and at the front. One hole is the firebox, and the other hole. We'll get to that later. And believe it or not, from this principle, which is immediately obvious to everyone, steam cannons and steam rifles were also developed. For the latter, there is a sketch in the Library of Congress in Washington, District of Columbia, which describes a steam-powered musket built in 1797 by 3 men from Philadelphia. It might have looked something like this: a cast-iron steam chamber shaped like a distillation vessel, with a rifle barrel attached to a shut-off valve. With 12 ounces of water, 30 musket balls were fired, penetrating deeply into a pine board 5 meters away. For a long time, the so-called air rifle by the French inventor Morin Bourgeois, who was born between 1550 and 1560, was considered the oldest steam weapon. He presented it to the French king Louis XIII in 1605. The idea for it probably came from the French mathematician David Rivaux de Florence, who was born in 1571 and wrote in his treatise on artillery, published in 1605, On Illustrations manly that water, when enclosed in a bombshell and heated, would cause the shell to explode. The first patent for a steam engine was granted in 1606 to the brilliant Spanish inventor Geronimo de Alliance Beaumont. Later, Denis Papin, who was born in France in 1647 but then lived in London, made crucial improvements. He incorporated his new inventions, such as the safety valve, among others. And in 1879, the so-called Papin's pot, which can be considered the forerunner of the modern pressure cooker. When steam engines had established themselves in all sorts of variations and uses, in 1814, the French inventor and staff officer of the Engineering Corps, the forerunner of the pioneers, Philippe-Henri de Girard, built a steam cannon. It consisted of a main tube, 6 smaller exhaust pipes, firing tubes, and the boiler that supplied the entire system with steam. Allegedly, this device could fire up to 180 musket balls per minute and was intended to be used in action. On March 30, 1814, during the Battle of Paris, also known as the Battle of Montmartre. On this day, during the course of the Napoleonic Wars, the alliance of Russians, Prussians, Austrians, Württembergers, and Bavarians defeated Emperor Napoleon and forced him to abdicate. Here, Russian troops are entering Paris. As for Girard's cannon, if it even existed as described, it was not used, but was destroyed when the Allies entered Paris. A decade later, on May 15, 1824, Jacob Perkins, who was originally from America and worked as an engineer in London, and to whom we also owe, for example, the high-pressure water heating system, received an English patent for a steam cannon. Shortly afterwards, between 1826 and 1829, the Russian Colonel Karelin also built a steam cannon with a caliber of 17.5 millimeters. It consisted of a green copper barrel that was fitted into a red copper casing. The cannon was capable of firing cannonballs at a rate of 50 rounds per minute. However, the military tests conducted in 1829 were not successfully pursued. As a result, the device was placed in a museum. Today, it can be admired at the Military Historical Museum of Artillery Engineers and Signal Corps in St. Petersburg. During this era, England and France were in strong rivalry, especially when it came to inventions. For example, in 1825 in France, the scientist and frigate captain Jacques-Philippe Marie-Jean de Montgery proposed the introduction of new weapons in his writings about war rockets, which then appeared in World War I. Flamethrowers and motorized guns, like the Austro-Daimler from 1906, equipped with 2 machine guns, as well as the use of military railways, which we already saw in the American Civil War in 1861. But Montgery also pointed out in his memorandum that Perkins could by no means be considered the intellectual father of steam cannons, but at most had devised some improvements. And in fact, the idea of the steam cannon can be traced back a long way. One of the first people who is said to have put it into practice was Archimedes of Syracuse. He was born between 287 and 212 before Christ, and was a famous builder of war machines, a critical manager, mathematician, physicist, and engineer. He had built a steam cannon out of thin copper sheet, the Ore Thunderer, which hurled iron balls with great noise and tremendous force. In any case, that's exactly what the brilliant universal scholar Leonardo da Vinci passed down to us around 1495, probably based on a manuscript that is lost to us today. A third of the instrument stands in a large amount of burning coals. Above it, there is a cistern with water, which falls through a valve into the breech of the cannon. And as a result, when water has fallen out, it will descend into the heated part of the machine and instantly turn into so much steam that it will seem marvelous, and especially when you see its fury and hear its roaring. 486 years later, in 1981, the Greek engineer Dr. Ioannis Tsarkas rebuilt Archimedes' steam cannon, but with an additional wooden board that was not included in Da Vinci's drawing. When Tsarkas' replica cannon was fired, the projectile only reached an initial speed of about 110 km/h and flew only 50 meters. But then, in 2006, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology took up the principle from Archimedes' drawing and omitted the wooden part that Tsarkas had added. In doing so, the scientists came across a solution that, as they wrote, is so simple, effective, and dangerous that they would not publish any details about it. However, this much has become known about their reconstructed Erzdonerer cannon. Here are the details. On November 5th, 2006, the practical test took place. For safety reasons, the cannon was installed underground. When a shell was fired at an earth embankment, the high-speed camera showed a muzzle velocity of over 300 meters per second. The kinetic energy of the shell was calculated to be about 23,000 joules. Joule is the unit of measurement for energy. 23,000 joules is about 1.3 to 1.8 times the energy of a projectile of NATO caliber 12.7 x 99 fired from a heavy machine gun, MG-50. In the excavated projectile, the tip of the shell had been driven into the casing, which in turn was filled with rock-hard earth. It only took about 2 minutes to fire another shot. This proved that the idea of a steam-powered cannon actually works. Let's take another look at history. The Scottish inventor James Watt, born in 1736, and known for improving the efficiency of the steam engine, had already had one of his engineers, Jabez Carter Hornblower, build a steam rocket in 1794. It was basically the same as the invention of the so-called Perkins steam throwing tube, but it came about 30 years earlier. But ultimately, it was Jacob Perkins who took the risk of giving the steam in the boiler an extraordinarily high pressure. To do this, he built a 7.6 centimeter thick, completely water-filled iron cylinder, enclosed in a furnace heated red-hot by a blower. The water, then pressed out under 30 to 50 attis, immediately turned into steam of very high pressure in a special chamber. Perkins usually worked with a pressure of 50 atmospheres, but he also conducted experiments up to 100 attis, and even planned for pressures of 220 atmospheres. As more and more became known about his work on a steam cannon, after all, he had to conduct practical tests in public, the London Mechanics Register of November 26, 1824 announced, "If Mr. Perkins' steam cannons were introduced into general use, wars would be very short, since no country could provide its population for attacks anymore." The official testing of Mr. Perkins' steam rifle took place on Tuesday the 6th, December 1825 in London's Regent's Park. Among the numerous observers from politics and the military was also the Duke of Wellington, who, together with the Prussian Marshal Blücher, had ushered in the end of Napoleon I's rule at the Battle of Belle Alliance or Vardelot in 1815. On December 6th, Perkins had fired the balls at short intervals, at an iron plate about 32 meters away, with the projectiles virtually pulverizing upon impact. In the second attempt, the projectiles penetrated wooden boards 28 centimeters thick, and in the third shot, a roughly 1 centimeter thick iron plate was cleanly pierced. The newspapers later reported on the event, stating that the cannon had fired for almost 2 hours, with a roar that resembled the loudest thunderclaps. Perkins also demonstrated how quickly a large number of projectiles could be fired. To do this, he had attached a tube filled with musket balls to the top of the firing barrel, essentially as a magazine. After releasing a lock, the balls would fall into the barrel by gravity and be ejected one after another at high speed. It was calculated that almost 1,000 balls could be fired per minute if several tubes filled with balls were attached as magazine sets using a rotating wheel. This story was also confirmed by the Schaffhausen industrialist Johann Conrad Fischer in his diary entries. The Swiss, also a reserve lieutenant colonel of the artillery, had met Perkins on the 27th of September 1827 in London, and during the conversation, the test firing in December of the previous year was also mentioned. As Fisher writes, Perkins claimed that he had fired 1,000 bullets within a minute, but that he was no longer allowed to conduct any more tests because the neighbors had complained about the noise. But the issue with the noise and the neighbors was only part of the truth. Because although the Duke of Wellington had commented on the spectacle by saying it was damn wonderful, the skeptics from the ministries based in the government district of Whitehall had raised their concerns. The lobbyists, as we would call them today, had argued that transporting the Perkins cannon was excessively difficult, since the boiler for the gun alone would weigh 5 tons. Also, neither the generator nor the other parts would last very long due to the enormous steam pressure and would then fail in battle. In short, all of Perkins' arguments had been dismissed, including his calculation that 15,000 pounds of gunpowder at a price of 525 pounds would be needed to fire 15,000 balls per hour for 16 hours. In contrast, all of this with his would cost no more than 4 pounds, using his steam cannon. And even his announcement that he would build a steam cannon at his own expense, one large enough to fire a 1-ton ball from English Dover across the Channel to French Calais, could not convince the gentlemen at the procurement office in Whitehall, thanks also to the good work of the lobbyists. In the end, their argument, "nothing beats gunpowder," prevailed, and the British government said goodbye to Perkins's steam cannon for test firing. In December 1825, the Prussian lieutenant general and military writer Johann Gottfried von Hoyer, who was born in Dresden in 1767, however, had a critical opinion. He believed that the audience was merely impressed and thus deceived by the noise and the unexpected effect. He also pointed out that any comparison with a powder rifle, which was available at that time, was missing. For this, he mentioned the needle gun developed by Johann Nikolaus von Dreyse in 1827 and introduced into the Prussian army in 1840. Hoyer argued, based on his own experiments, that a projectile from the needle gun with a caliber of 15.43 millimeters and a 12.5 gram powder charge could reach about 60 meters, and that it would penetrate an iron plate about 9 centimeters thick, which was nailed to a wooden post about 7.5 centimeters thick. And a second plate of the same thickness on the back of the post was dented almost to the point of tearing by the impact of the projectile. Even though the English government rejected Perkins' steam gun after his demonstration in December 1825, at least France commissioned him to design a steam gun for their artillery. It then had a wrought iron rifle barrel 91 centimeters long and a caliber of 7.62 centimeters, and was supposedly capable of firing several 104-pound balls per minute. Today it is assumed that the device was sent in October 1828 to Vincennes, which is located on the outskirts of Paris. However, during a firing test at the local armory, it turned out that the steam cannon did not have enough power to fire a ball more than half the distance that an ordinary cannon of the same caliber could reach. With that, Jacob Perkins had also failed in France. He did not receive any compensation for his work from Paris, so once again, commercial success eluded him. However, this was mostly his own fault, since he repeatedly spent huge amounts of money on his experiments, even with borrowed money. It was left to his son, Angier Mark Perkins, and his grandson, Loftus Perkins, both also engineers, to achieve some success later on. There was also a steam gun in the United States of America, the so-called Winans steam gun, developed by William Joslin and Charles S. Dickinson, both from the state of Ohio. After they had fallen out, Dickinson had the cannon built in 1860 by the wealthy manufacturer and locomotive builder Ross Winans from Baltimore, Maryland. Later, the cannon was mistakenly named after him. Dickinson had boasted that his steam cannon could fire up to 400 rounds per minute from a distance of 300 meters, wiping out an entire regiment in one go. When the American Civil War broke out on April 12, 1861, between the Union in the North and the Confederacy in the South, Winan, like the vast majority of Baltimore's residents, was wholeheartedly on the side of the South. Then, when in the early morning of the 19th April, about 220 soldiers from 4 companies of the 6th Massachusetts Northern States Volunteer Regiment were marching through Baltimore on their way to reinforce the Washington garrison, they were confronted by reportedly 10,000 citizens, with stones being thrown and occasional shots fired from houses as well. It was only after the 6th Regiment opened fire, and shortly after, about 50 local armed police officers placed a Condor vehicle between them and the demonstrators, that the situation calmed down. During this Baltimore riot, or the so-called clashes in Baltimore, 5 soldiers and 12 civilians were killed, whilst hundreds were wounded, the first casualties of the Civil War. In order to be able to use the steam cannon against a possible attack by troops from the South, the Baltimore police had confiscated it and, like other seized weapons, displayed it under guard in the city. After peace had been restored, the cannon was taken to Winan's factory for repairs and then returned to Dickinson. He then tried to transport it from Baltimore to the small town of Harper's Ferry in West Virginia, about 110 kilometers away, to sell it to the Confederate forces there. However, he didn't get very far with his cannon and crew. Only about 20 kilometers. On May 11, 1861, near Ellicott City in Maryland, They were first captured by Union troops under Colonel Jones and then taken to the Union camp in Relay, 12 kilometers to the south. Allegedly, the steam cannon was used there to defend the Thomas Railroad Bridge between Relay and Elkridge. It is now assumed that the Wynand steam cannon was scrapped at some point during the Civil War, which lasted until 1865 or shortly thereafter. However, no credible evidence of its actual effectiveness has been recorded. To conclude this review, here's something under the motto, "Necessity is the mother of invention." The curious story of the English Holman projector, named after its originator, the machine tool manufacturer Holman Brothers Limited. This strange device was an anti-aircraft weapon of the Royal Navy during World War II and was mainly used between early 1940 and late 1941. All of the approximately 4,500 different models produced in the following years of the war were all based on the same principle of a pneumatic mortar. It worked by using compressed air or high-pressure steam to fire an explosive projectile at low-flying German aircrafts. For example, at Heinkel HE 111s during torpedo attacks or during skip bombing attacks by Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor. However, both the range and speed were too low to provide effective fire protection over a ship. In contrast, the Navy, since it had few real anti-aircraft guns at the start of the war, with their Holman projector, they hoped to create a diversion or deterrent effect, forcing the German Air Force to bomb from higher altitudes, which would reduce their accuracy. But it was also unintentionally comical that the soldiers of both genders had to work with this device, which seemed more than a little strange. In the absence of proper ammunition being supplied, they often had to do so quite seriously. For example, they shot at German planes with potatoes, which earned this English wonder weapon the nickname potato thrower. Allegedly, the crew of a cargo ship even managed to shoot down 2 planes with their Holman projector. But as everyone knows, even today, just like back then, the words of Otto von Bismarck still hold true. There is never as much lying as before an election, during a war, and after a hunt.